Millionaire CEO refused to help until a poor little girl with a baby melted his heart. The city of New York glittered with lights, but beneath the shine lay shadows of hunger and despair. At the top of a towering skyscraper, Michael Anderson stood gazing out from his corner office. His suit was sharp, tailored to perfection, a reflection of his wealth and status. On his desk lay contracts worth millions, yet his eyes carried no warmth, only ambition. Michael was a man celebrated for his empire, but whispered about for his lack of compassion. Colleagues admired his power but feared his coldness. In boardrooms, he spoke with authority that silenced rooms. To the poor on the streets, he was a man who never looked down, never slowed his pace. He had trained himself to see the world through numbers, not emotions. To him, every person was either an asset or a liability. Michael's philosophy was simple. Survival belonged only to the strongest. Help yourself or be left behind. Those were his silent words to the world. It was late evening when rain tapped against the tall glass windows. The city below blurred into streaks of grey and gold. Michael gathered his papers, slid them into his leather briefcase, and checked his watch. Time was money, and he wasted none of it. The cleaning staff in the office avoided eye contact as he passed by. They knew he had no time for pleasantries. His steps echoed down the polished marble hallway. Every move of his carried authority, but none carried warmth. Outside, thunder rumbled and raindrops splattered across the pavement. The streets glistened like mirrors under the city lights. Beggars huddled together under thin pieces of cardboard. Mothers clutched their children, shielding them from the cold rain. An old man extended a trembling hand, hoping for a coin or two. Michael saw them, but his eyes passed over them as though they were invisible. To him, they were part of the city's background noise. He believed poverty was a result of weakness, of laziness. If I could rise, so can they, he often told himself. His black limousine waited at the curb, its driver holding an umbrella. The driver's eyes dropped respectfully as Michael approached. The umbrella shielded him from the storm, yet the cries of the streets still reached his ears. "Spare some change, sir," a weak voice called. Michael's eyes flicked toward it for a fraction of a second. A woman in rags was kneeling on the wet pavement, her face pale and desperate. He tightened his jaw and looked away. His driver opened the limousine door, the interior glowing with warm leather seats. "Sir," the driver said softly, but Michael gave only a curt nod. The city was alive with chaos, car horns, sirens, rushing footsteps. Yet Michael sat in silence as he entered the vehicle. The door shut, muting the world outside. The rain trickled down the tinted windows like tears. Inside, the air smelled of leather and cologne. Michael loosened his tie slightly, his face unreadable. The driver waited for instructions. "Home," Michael ordered flatly. The engine purred, and the limousine pulled away from the curb. On the sidewalks, children barefoot in puddles chased scraps of food. Michael's gaze brushed past them without a flicker of emotion. His phone buzzed with a notification. A message from a board member, news about a successful merger. He allowed himself a small smile, one of satisfaction, not warmth. The glow of the screen lit up his sharp features. For him, the night wasn't about rain or struggle, it was about victory. He leaned back, scrolling through the numbers, reading about profits. His mind danced with figures, projections, and strategies. Outside the glass, a homeless boy knocked weakly at the car window. Raindrops streaked across the boy's face, mixing with tears. Michael didn't even turn his head. The driver glanced nervously, unsure whether to shoo the boy away, but Michael's indifference was answer enough. "Keep driving," he said, voice cold as the rain. The boy's small figure blurred into the distance as the limousine sped away. Michael rested his head back, eyes closing for a brief moment. He thought of the empire he had built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. He remembered the sleepless nights, the ruthless decisions, the sacrifices. To him, those sacrifices justified everything. Why should he feel sorry for those who never tried? The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the car roof. Lightning flashed, illuminating alleys filled with human misery. Michael remained unmoved, as though insulated from the storm. He believed compassion was weakness. Kindness in his eyes was a distraction. Empathy was a luxury only the poor could afford. The limousine cruised past a soup kitchen where people lined up in the rain. Volunteers handed out steaming bowls of soup. Michael's eyes lingered for half a second. Then he looked back at his phone, dismissing the sight. To him, charity was a mask for inefficiency. Give a man soup today and he'll beg tomorrow, he often thought. Teach him to fight and he'll never need to beg. He clung to that belief like armor against the cries of the city. The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wanted to speak but knew his employer's stance too well. Silence hung heavy in the car, broken only by the rain. Michael's reflection stared back at him in the glass window. It was the face of success, but also the face of solitude. Crowds on the sidewalk moved like shadows, rushed, tired, unnoticed. Streetlights flickered, reflecting in puddles that swallowed footsteps. Michael tapped his fingers on the armrest, impatient to reach his mansion. The luxury that awaited him was his sanctuary from the world's chaos. Inside those walls, no cries for help could reach him. No hungry faces, no desperate hands, no broken pleas. Only silence, wealth, and control. Yet tonight, the storm outside felt louder than usual. The cries sharper, the faces more haunting. He shifted in his seat, dismissing the strange unease. He was a man of logic, not feelings, and logic told him compassion was useless. Still, the memory of the old man's trembling hand lingered faintly. He clenched his jaw, shaking it off. The driver stopped briefly at a red light. Raindrops raced down the window, blurring the view. A woman carrying a child hurried across the street, soaked to the skin. Michael's eyes followed them for a second, then snapped back to his phone. He scrolled through emails, pretending the sight hadn't touched him. The light turned green, and the limousine moved forward. The city seemed endless that night, filled with cries, lights, and echoes. Every corner whispered stories of survival, but Michael refused to listen. His heart was a fortress, sealed behind walls of wealth. To the world, he was powerful. To himself, he was untouchable. But the storm had its own voice, pressing against the glass, a whisper in the dark that he couldn't quite ignore. Michael stared out once more, his face unreadable. The limousine rolled past dark alleys where shadows curled like secrets. He exhaled slowly, willing himself into calmness. The night was just another night, he reminded himself. Tomorrow would be business as usual. But deep within, something unseen had already begun to stir. Michael's eyes, still hardened from years of indifference, caught a sight that stopped his steps mid-stride. Just ahead, under a flickering streetlight that buzzed and hummed against the rain, sat a frail little girl huddled close to the pavement. She looked no older than 10, her thin frame trembling from the cold, her hair damp and clinging to her face as she tried to shield the small bundle in her arms. Wrapped in a torn, faded blanket, the baby she held cried softly, too. His sound barely piercing the storm, yet sharp enough to reach Michael's ears. The girl's lips were pale, her cheeks hollow from hunger, but her eyes lifted toward him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Those eyes, wide and innocent, locked onto his, and for a brief moment Michael felt something shift deep in his chest. The limousine door stood open just behind him, the warmth of safety and wealth waiting, but he lingered in place, caught by the fragile scene before him. The girl's small hands adjusted the blanket around the baby, trying to protect him from the rain that seeped through the holes. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice fragile, almost breaking against the noise of the city. "My brother is hungry." Her words were simple, yet they struck with a weight he could not explain. Michael's jaw tightened, his instinct to turn away stronger than any flicker of feeling. His entire life, he had taught himself to silence moments like this, to ignore need and weakness, but her voice lingered like a bell that refused to stop ringing. He forced himself to straighten his back, pulling his gaze away, and stepped toward the limousine. Yet, as he passed her, he could feel her eyes following him, clinging to him as though he might be the last chance she had. The driver shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between the girl and his employer, but he dared not speak. Michael placed one hand on the frame of the car door, preparing to duck inside, yet his chest felt unusually heavy. Behind him, the baby's cry rose higher, thin and piercing, a cry that carried not just hunger, but the ache of helplessness. Michael froze again, his reflection in the glossy car window staring back at him. But this time, it was not the same confident face he saw every night. There was something unsettled in his own eyes, something restless, as though a hidden part of him was daring him to turn around. He clenched his jaw harder, refusing to acknowledge the pull. The rain dripped from the edges of his coat as he inhaled Ply, searching for logic to bury the faint stirrings of compassion. But logic offered no comfort this time. He heard the girl's soft murmur as she tried to soothe the baby, rocking him gently, though her own body shook with cold. "It's okay, Ethan," she whispered, her voice quivering. "Don't cry, I'm here." The name, Ethan, struck his ears strangely, unfamiliar yet oddly grounding. Michael's grip on the car door tightened until his knuckles whitened. He told himself he didn't care, told himself it wasn't his responsibility, yet his feet betrayed him by pausing longer than he intended. The driver cleared his throat softly, waiting for the command to drive, but Michael remained still, his back half turned toward the fragile figures on the pavement. Emily, though weak, lifted her chin again and tried to meet his gaze once more. Her eyes were not just begging. They carried a silent plea, the kind that spoke of nights spent hungry, of days spent unseen by thousands who walked past. They carried a resilience that Michael could not ignore, even as he forced his body to move. He stepped into the limousine at last, retreating into the warmth, but the moment the door shut, the baby's cry echoed louder in his ears than any storm. He leaned back into the seat, exhaling sharply, yet his chest remained tight, as though something inside refused to be silenced. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hesitant, sensing his employer's distraction. For the first time in years, Michael did not immediately issue an order. He sat there, staring through the rain-streaked glass at the faint, blurred figure of the little girl, still sitting under the broken light. His mind told him to dismiss it, to forget it the moment the car moved, but his heart whispered otherwise. He rubbed his temples with one hand, frustrated at himself for even caring, yet as the car pulled forward slowly, Emily, his image etched itself deeper into his memory. The thin arms, the trembling hands, the quiet courage of a child refusing to abandon her brother. Michael turned his head sharply away from the window, trying to bury the image under the glow of his phone screen, but the numbers and words before him felt strangely meaningless. He shut the device off and let it fall onto the seat beside him. Silence pressed in around him, but it was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the ghost of her voice. "Please, sir. My brother is hungry." He closed his eyes, hoping the darkness might erase her face. Yet it only made her pleading stare more vivid. For a man who had built walls around his heart for decades, one glance from a starving child had cracked them in ways he couldn't understand. Michael exhaled again, long and weary, his hand resting against the window, feeling the cold seeping through the glass. Outside, the little girl was already disappearing into the storm, but inside his chest, she remained, haunting, unshakable, a whisper that would not fade. Michael lay in his king-sized bed, surrounded by the silence of his sprawling mansion, yet peace would not come. The rain had stopped outside, but within his mind the storm still raged. He shifted against the silk sheets, closing his eyes tightly, but every time he tried to force sleep, he saw her again, The frail little girl, her damp hair clinging to her pale face, her thin arms wrapped protectively around the fragile baby. The haunting sound of the infant's cry echoed in his ears, mingling with her trembling words, and it made the night feel endless. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, scrolling through emails, financial reports, and stock updates, but none of it held his focus. Numbers blurred before his eyes as the image of Emily's pleading stare cut through them like glass. He tossed the phone aside with a frustrated sigh, running a hand over his face, trying to bury the unease. He had conquered business rivals, tamed ruthless markets, and bent entire corporate ions to his will. Yet here he was, broken by the memory of a single starving child. The clock ticked loudly in the room, each second mocking his restlessness. By dawn, his eyes were heavy, but not from sleep. They were heavy from a guilt he had never known. He dressed sharply as always, his tie knotted with precision, his suit flawless, yet there was a crack beneath the surface, a hesitation in his movements. As the limousine rolled through the city streets the next morning, he tried to drown his thoughts in the familiar rhythm of business calls, but his voice lacked its usual steel. The driver's gaze flicked toward him through the mirror, noticing the difference, but said nothing. Then, as the car turned onto the same avenue where the storm had trapped him the night before, Michael's breath caught in his throat. Under the broken streetlight, like an unfinished sentence written by fate, Emily was there again. The baby lay weak against her chest, his tiny face pale, his small cries softer now, not from strength but from exhaustion. Emily's hair clung to her cheeks, her thin body trembling from the cold morning air, yet when she saw the limousine slow near the curb, her eyes lifted. For a moment, Michael thought she would look away in shame, but instead, she managed a faint smile, fragile and heartbreaking. That smile carried no joy. It was a mixture of gratitude for being noticed and despair for being unseen too long. As she smiled, tears welled up and slipped down her face, glistening in the morning light. Michael's chest tightened painfully, a sensation he had almost forgotten he could feel. His driver hesitated at the wheel, glancing back silently as if waiting for permission. For years, Michael had trained himself to keep moving, to never stop, to never allow weakness to distract him. Yet here, in this small corner of the city, with the weight of her gaze pressing in, to him, his rules began to crumble. The air inside the limousine grew heavy, his breathing uneven, his hands curling into fists on his lap. He could have looked away. He could have buried himself in the safety of his empire. But instead, for the first time in years, Michael felt his body leaning forward, as though pulled by an invisible force. "Stop the car," he heard himself say, his voice low, almost foreign to his own ears. The driver blinked in surprise, unsure if he had heard correctly, but when Michael repeated the command, there was no mistaking the crack in his tone. The limousine rolled to a halt beside the broken streetlight. Michael's heart pounded as he stared through the glass, his cold exterior trembling with a heat he had long denied. Emily sat frozen, uncertain if she was dreaming, clutching her baby brother tighter, her eyes widening as the window lowered slightly, and she saw the powerful man inside finally looking at her, not past her, not through her, but at her. And in that fragile moment, something inside Michael Anderson broke open, leaving him no longer the same man who had walked past them the night before. Michael stepped out of the limousine, the weight of the city's noise pressing down around him. But in that moment, all he could hear was the shallow cry of the baby and the soft breath of the little girl before him. His polished shoes touched the wet pavement, splashing against puddles, yet he barely noticed as his eyes remained fixed on Emily, who clutched her brother as though the world might snatch him away if she loosened her grip for even a second. His steps were measured, cautious, not with the arrogance he usually carried, but with a strange vulnerability he himself did not recognize. Emily shrank back slightly as he drew closer, her small shoulders curling protectively around Ethan, but she did not look away. Her eyes, red from sleeplessness, followed him with a quiet mix of fear and fragile hope. He stopped just a few feet away, his voice rougher than he intended when he innerly spoke. "Where are your parents?" For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by Ethan's weak whimper. Emily's lips trembled as though the words themselves were too heavy to release, but she managed to whisper through the cold air, "They're gone. It's just me and him. His name is Ethan." The sound of her voice struck through Michael like a blade, cutting deeper than he had expected, and the way she said the baby's name, so tender, so desperate, made the walls around his heart crumble further. He looked at Ethan then, the baby's face pale and tired, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, and for the first time in his life, Michael felt his own heart ache for someone other than himself. Something inside him shattered, something long buried beneath years of pride and distance. He did not argue with himself, did not calculate risks, did not weigh consequences like he always had. Instead, he moved instinctively, bending down and reaching toward the child. Emily froze, her eyes wide with confusion, unsure if this man in the expensive suit could be trusted, but she did not resist when Michael's hands gently slipped under the baby's fragile body. Ethan let out a soft whimper as he was lifted, his tiny fists twitching, but instead of coldness, he was met with warmth pressed against Michael's chest. Michael cradled him awkwardly at first, unused to such vulnerability in his arms, but something about the child's small weight felt grounding, real, undeniable. He looked back at Emily, who was watching him with fear and disbelief, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. For the first time, Michael lowered his voice into something gentle, steady. "Come with me." He didn't wait for her to answer before signaling his driver with a sharp nod. The man quickly opened the rear door of the limousine, his own eyes wide with surprise at what he was witnessing. Michael, still holding Ethan close, turned slightly and gestured for Emily to follow. Her bare feet hesitated on the wet ground, her thin frame trembling. But the sight of her baby brother in the arms of the man she had begged only the night before gave her courage. She rose slowly, clutching the tattered edges of the blanket around her, and walked toward the car as though stepping into a dream she could hardly believe. Michael shifted carefully, ensuring Ethan remained warm against him, and helped Emily into the seat before sliding in himself. The door shut, sealing them away from the cold street. And for the first time in his life, Michael Anderson found himself offering help without expecting a single thing in return. The car pulled forward into the city, carrying with it a man, a little girl, and a baby whose fragile cries had melted a heart that once believed it could never be touched. The limousine glided silently through the iron gates of Michael's vast estate, the manicured lawns glistening under the soft drizzle, the towering mansion rising like a fortress of glass and stone against the grey sky. As the car came to a halt, the staff, accustomed to strict routines and Michael's cold detachment, hurried forward, but their eyes widened at the sight of their employer stepping out with a baby cradled in his arms and a timid little girl clinging to his side. Without a word, Michael handed Ethan gently to the housekeeper, his voice unusually soft as he instructed her to fetch warm clothes and prepare food immediately. The woman, startled by his tone, nodded quickly and carried the child inside with care, while another maid took Emily's trembling hand, leading her into the warmth of the grand foyer. Emily gasped as she stepped across the polished marble floor, her reflection shimmering beneath her worn shoes, her eyes darting to the crystal chandeliers above that sparkled like captured stars. Yet it wasn't the wealth that stunned her most. It was the kindness in the sudden flurry of hands wrapping a blanket around her smart, towel shoulders, the soft smile of the cook who pressed a steaming bowl of soup into her hands, the gentle way someone brushed her damp hair from her forehead. For the first time in days, Emily felt safe. In the living room, Michael watched quietly from a distance, his tall frame leaning against the edge of a chair, his usual mask of authority slipping as he saw Ethan's face brighten at the taste of warm milk. The baby's tiny lips curled into a laugh, light and pure, a sound so delicate it seemed to echo against the walls like music. Michael's chest tightened at the sound, his throat constricting with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in decades. Emily, too, began to change before his eyes. Her hollow cheeks filled with color as she nibbled at a piece of bread, her eyes sparkling with gratitude each time they met his, her little shoulders relaxing as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Michael had built his empire on numbers, contracts, and ruthless decisions, but no boardroom victory had ever made him feel the way their laughter did now. As he stood there, something deeper stirred, pulling him backward into a past he had long tried to bury. He remembered his own childhood, flashes of warm hands guiding him, the gentle voice of his mother reading bedtime stories, the reassuring strength of his father's embrace. But those memories darkened quickly as grief returned. The long nights after the accident that had taken them both, the silence of an empty house, the cold determination that had driven him to chase wealth as if it could fill the void. For years, he had armored himself in success, convincing the world he was untouchable. Yet here, in the presence of a fragile girl and her baby brother, the armor cracked wide open. His eyes softened as he noticed Emily clutching a small pillow, her lips curving into a shy smile as she whispered something that made Ethan giggle. That sound pierced through him, not like a weapon, but like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He sank slowly into an armchair, resting his elbows on his knees, unable to tear his gaze away from them. For the first time, the house no longer felt like a museum of wealth. It felt alive, breathing with warmth and innocence. His staff exchanged hushed whispers, amazed to see a side of their employer they had thought impossible. But Michael wasn't listening. He was lost in the simple miracle unfolding before him. He realized with sudden clarity that no fortune, no skyscraper, no contract could compare to the feeling swelling in his chest. In Emily's smile and Ethan's laughter, he saw not strangers, but the family he had lost long ago, and as that truth settled within him, Michael understood. His heart, once frozen, had been transformed forever. Weeks slipped by, and the rhythm of Michael's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. The mornings, once filled with hurried phone calls and cold meetings, now began with the sound of Ethan's giggles echoing through the hallways and Emily's soft footsteps as she peeked into his study, asking if she could sit nearby while he worked. Papers and contracts still covered his desk, but they no longer carried the same weight. Instead, he found himself pausing mid-sentence to watch Ethan toddle across the carpet, or to listen as Emily shyly read aloud from the books she had discovered in the mansion's grand library. The legal process that had once seemed daunting to others moved swiftly for a man of Michael's influence, yet for the first time he used his power not for himself, but for them. When the documents were finally signed and sealed, making him their official guardian, Michael felt a surge of pride unlike any business triumph he had ever known. The news spread quietly among his circle, shocking those who thought of him as ouchable and selfish, but he no longer cared for their opinions. His mansion, once echoing only with the sound of his own footsteps, now carried the music of laughter and joy. The long dining table that had stood empty was filled each evening with warmth as Emily told stories between bites of food and Ethan banged his little spoon against his bowl, drawing chuckles even from the usually stern butler. The staff, once reserved and fearful of their employer, now smiled freely as they found themselves part of a home instead of a workplace. Michael often caught himself standing in doorways, simply watching Emily's eyes shine as she drew pictures with crayons he had bought for her, watching Ethan fall asleep against her shoulder, watching the way love had transformed every corner of his once cold world. At night, as the city lights glittered beyond the mansion windows, he would sit quietly in the nursery, his heart swelling as he tucked the children into their beds. He pulled the blankets up gently around Ethan, brushing a soft kiss across the baby's forehead, then turned to Emily, who whispered a drowsy, "Good night," before drifting into dreams with a smile. For a long time he remained there in the dim glow of the lamp, gazing at their peaceful faces, marveling at how far he had come from the man who once turned his back on the suffering of others. Wealth had given him power, but it had never given him peace. These two innocent souls had given him both without asking for anything in return. Standing there, Michael felt the truth settle deep within him. Money could build empires, but compassion built a life worth living. As he stepped out of the room and closed the door softly behind him, his reflection in the hallway mirror seemed different, softer, almost unrecognizable from the hardened man he once was. He leaned against the wall, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and whispered to himself with a tenderness that surprised even him, "Helping them saved me too." In that moment, Michael Anderson was no longer just a millionaire CEO. He was something far greater, a father, a protector, and a man reborn through the simple, extraordinary power of love.